Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm pleased to take a call on the Legal Services Bill, and thank you for holding my place for me. I just wanted to reflect back on, very quickly, some of the comments that were made by Mr Garrett. And I do think that it's a shame in this debate that whilst Mr Garrett very nobly will often recognise the points of agreement, and sometimes there are a few in this debate, that very quickly we seem to descend into situations which by and large are the exception, not the norm. And we must, within our criminal justice system, organise a system that is still based around the principle, the ultimate principle, which I would hope that he would agree with, that is that people are innocent until proven guilty. And if Mr Garrett would like to present to this House a methodology where we could maintain that principle, which is the fundamental foundation of our criminal justice system, maintain that principle and still iron out some of the issues that he raised, I would be happy to engage with him on that point. But arbitrary cut-offs such as those that were suggested, I assume off the cuff, and I granted, do not do that. So I'm happy to engage in that debate, but we must keep in place that fundamental principle ultimately. And again, I would say to the member that arbitrary cut-offs don't work, and I'd like to perhaps expand on that when it comes to the principle of 3 strikes and you're out, because again, I think that is probably the ultimate demonstration of arbitrary cut-offs, which remove the very important principle of judicial discretion, which is a key part of our criminal justice system. But I might come back to that. First, I'd like to, though, address the substantive matters in this bill, the Legal Services Bill, which does overhaul the legal services system in New Zealand as it has sat since about 1991 in its current form. Those who have been listening to this debate will know that the set of changes that we're examining in the House today were a consequence of a review that was carried out by Dame Margaret Baisley, and I think the reason that review became so controversial was because she pointed out the failings in our system, in our publicly funded legal services system, and the fact that some quite wide-ranging accusations were made, the fact that some of the actors in that system, the rogues, were such a key part of her review, I think did bring the issue to the fore. And it's right that that was done, but I would be loath for anyone to assume that all of our publicly funded legal services are characterised by some of the individuals that Dame Margaret Baisley highlighted. And in Manukau in particular, we have seen some incredibly good individuals working in that area who have had their reputations smeared by the very blanket accusations that were made. And I think it's important that ultimately we must ensure that public confidence is retained in our system, and that would have been perhaps restored had Simon Power as Minister gone and spoken to the bar in that area, and unfortunately he did not. And in fact, at the Justice Select Committee, Justice and Electoral Select Committee, we questioned the chair of the Legal Services Agency as to whether or not he had gone and spoken to the bar in Manukau, and he had not at that time either. I would like to highlight that Leanne Dalziel and Charles Chevelle did make that effort, but what they were seeking, the bar themselves were seeking probably an act by the Minister himself or the agency, rather than just the opposition, who of course took a key interest in the area. So whilst it's important that we do act in an expedient way to the recommendations made by Dame Margaret, it's also important that we get it right, because this is an incredibly important arm of our justice system. And what are the objectives that I think must be maintained when examining this piece of legislation? Well, the government has pointed a couple of them out. One of them is managing rising costs, and that's absolutely understandable. we're looking at a legal aid system which is costing about $130 million per year, but most of the increase that we've seen has been in the criminal justice area, and particularly some high-profile, larger cases that we've seen have sucked up a considerable amount of that, and also claims through the Waitangi tribunal. So that is one element that the government's interested in tackling, but in my mind, that ultimately is secondary to some of the much more important principles of, one, ensuring an ongoing access to justice, and secondly, upholding the quality, and this is something that was, I think, pointed out well by my colleague in the Maori Party, upholding the quality of the service that the public access via legal aid, and public confidence in that service is incredibly important. Now, Labor will support this bill, though, to Select Committee, because there are elements within it that we absolutely support, but we do have concerns as well, and I want to talk to both of those areas. We are pleased that the Public Defence Service will be expanded. That was something that was launched by the Justice Minister at that time in 2004, who obviously was Phil Goff, because the PDS demonstrated that we could have a system of salaried public defenders that would standardise a high quality of defence and iron out some of those issues that come on a fee basis. And it was a... I do think that, as far as my reading on what happened in the transition from the recommendations from Dame Margaret Baisley and what has come through from the government, is that there are a couple of areas that may not have been covered by the extension of the public defender system. Be interested in government members willing to clarify this for me, but I understand that the Minister of Justice announced back in April that we would see the service extend to Hamilton, Wellington and Christchurch. But also I think Dame Margaret Baisley made a recommendation of Palmerston North. Now, I'm not sure whether or not the government picked up that recommendation, but happy to hear whether or not that's the case, because obviously she would have seen some reason for that, and I'd be interested to see where the government disagrees with her in that regard. Do want to highlight that we're seeing another re-announcement of the extension of the PDS, something that was announced back in April, and here we are again talking it up. It is like the Korpu Bridge, which I think we've announced. Darren Hughes, how many times have we announced? Has the government announced the Korpu Bridge? I think we're up to 8. So perhaps we'll see the Public Defence Service re-emerge as a Christmas gift as well, perhaps, given that we're such a fan of their re-announcement with this government. I also want to touch briefly on the fact that the government is placing greater emphasis on the use of community law services. And now I absolutely endorse that, but I do just want to flag again my concern that it is one thing to acknowledge the good work that the community law centres do. It is another to demonstrate to them that they will have ongoing sustained funding. Now, the Minister of Justice has continually stood up and given us that assurance, but as far as I am aware, they are still ultimately, in the framework of the funding framework that they're under, they are ultimately at the mercy of the Lawyers and Conveyancers Special Fund, which, because it's based on an allocation of interest being divvied between a bank, I think it's a 60-40 split, and to the community law centres, it is not sustainable, consistent, and the amount of time and energy that the network of community law centres have wasted on worry about the source of their funding, I think, is unnecessary. And if we are going to acknowledge the good work that they do, we should give them greater certainty in the way that they are funded. In terms of our concerns, I want to touch briefly on those. Leanne Dalziel has already pointed out that it's one thing to say we want to cut down on the cost via legal aid. It's another to try and incentivise within our criminal justice system the constant use of not guilty pleas, which Mr Garrett has to acknowledge is perhaps an unintended consequence of his legislation, but a consequence nonetheless, that we have essentially incentivised not guilty pleas, which will mean that we are likely to see an increase in legal aid.
Order.
So does Mr Garrett perhaps propose that if you end up being on a third strike, you then don't get any more legal aid as well?